So, have you ever really wondered how all those decisions about housing growth in your town actually get made? It's probably a lot more complex than you think. Today, we're going to unpack Connecticut's housing growth law, and we're going to zero in on the 38 towns in the capital region. And just to be clear, our goal here is to explain the mechanics, how the whole system is actually designed to work. You see, for the longest time, planning felt super local, right? It was all happening on a town-by-town basis. But that's starting to change. The state's shifting its approach, and now planning is being looked at through a much, much wider lens, a regional one that covers the entire state. So, let's zoom in on our focus for today, the capital region. We're talking about these 38 specific towns you see here. And while they're all part of one big regional housing plan, here's the really important part. The plan does not treat every town the same, not at all. Housing goals get handed out very differently from one town to the next. Okay, so how does the law figure out who gets what? Well, it all starts with a concept that causes a ton of confusion, the lowest 20 towns. You may have heard this term thrown around, but what does it actually mean? Let's clear that up. First things first, lowest 20 does not mean 20% of the towns in the region. Nope. It's a specific, fixed list of 20 towns from across the entire state of Connecticut, and they're identified using a very particular financial yardstick. So what is this yardstick? It's called and get ready for this, Adjusted Equalized Net Grand List Per Capita. Yeah, I know it's a mouthful, but don't worry about the name. All it really is a fancy way to measure a town's financial health. It just compares its property tax base to its population. At the end of the day, it's all about a town's ability to pay its bills. So remember that statewide list of 20 towns? How many of them are actually in the capital region that we're talking about? Well, it turns out it's only about 6 to 8 of them. So we're really only talking about a small, very specific group within the region's 38 towns. And this is so important because this one distinction creates two totally different paths. That small group of lowest 20 towns, they're basically protected. Their focus is on preservation and rehab, not on adding lots of new housing, which means the responsibility for all that new growth, it falls squarely on the shoulders of the other 30-plus towns, which are then assessed for their capacity to grow. All right, so let's shift our focus to that bigger group, the other 30 or so towns. How does the state decide which of them should take on new housing and, how much? For this group, everything comes down to one key concept, municipal capacity. This is the central idea the law uses to figure out which communities are best equipped to support more housing. So what goes into measuring capacity? Well, the state looks at a whole mix of things. There are economic factors like income levels and property values. Then there are physical ones, like how much housing is already there and if there's available land. And really, crucially, they look at location, things like a town's access to jobs and transportation. Now, that last point, access to jobs and transportation, that can make people a little nervous. So it's really important to get what the law means here. It's just a planning metric. It is not a requirement for people to change how they live. It's not telling anyone to sell their car or change their commute. So what does access actually mean in this context? It's really just about geography. The state is basically looking at a map and asking, is this town physically close to major job centers? Is it near highways or bus routes? Does it have a downtown? It's purely an assessment of a town's location on the map, not about people's personal habits. So when you put all these pieces together, you start to see that this is a really fundamental shift in how planning works in Connecticut. We're moving away from the old way of doing things and toward a totally new model. Think about it like this. The old model was simple. Growth followed infrastructure. If a town had sewer lines and utilities ready to go, that's where development happened. But the new model, it flips that idea on its head. It's about regional redistribution. Now, housing targets are spread across towns based on their capacity, not just where the pipes are already in the ground. And this is a crucial point to remember. What we're talking about here is a big picture shift in regional planning policy. This is not a specific zoning change being voted on at your local town hall meeting. This is the high-level framework that comes before all of that and influences those leader decisions. Which, of course, brings us to the bottom line. Why does any of this matter? Why is it so important to understand this framework? Well, because these abstract targets and policies eventually lead to very real-world impacts in our communities. At the end of the day, what we all really want to know is, what does this mean for my town? How does all this high-level policy stuff actually trickle down and affect my community? Think of this system of assigning growth targets as the starting gun for a much longer race.
Once these targets are set, they kick off a whole chain reaction. Towns might start proposing zoning changes to meet them. They'll update their inventories of available land. And it can even affect their eligibility for state funding for things like infrastructure or other local projects.
So let's boil it all down for the capital region. What are the key things to remember? First, it's a two-tiered system. A small handful of towns are set aside to focus on preservation. Second, most towns, the big majority, get growth targets based on that idea of capacity. And third, this whole thing represents a major shift toward a regional redistribution model for planning housing growth. And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. Now that you know how the mechanics of this system actually work, the real question is, how can this knowledge help you and other residents have more informed, more constructive conversations as this whole planning process keeps moving forward in your own community?